No wine. James is portrayed like that in early church literature. No wine. Rechabites drank no wine. James wore only linen. Basically, that's what the Rechabites do. That's what Bannus does. To me, Bannus is almost a picture of James. James, brother of Jesus, that is. So how do we know about James, brother of Jesus? Well, you won't discover him by reading the New Testament very, very much, because he's written out. Because he's Paul's inveterate opponent. And our New Testament is Paulinized. But where will you find him? In early church testimony. Probably more about James in early church testimony than any other figure in the Gospels, including Jesus. Because they don't know anything more about Jesus except what's in the Gospels. So if they say anything to you about Jesus from the Gospels, so that's not original testimony. We have material in the early church testimony about James that's not in the Scripture. A good deal of it, actually. And I cover all that in my James book. They don't know anything about Paul, the early church fathers, except what you have there. They don't know anything about the other apostles hardly at all. And so on and so forth. So I submit that James, the early church fathers who conserve material know more about James than any other early figure. And lo and behold, in the Nag Hammadi texts that popped up that we didn't know about, James is a hero of the Nag Hammadi text. And Paul is almost unmentionable. We just had a gospel according to Judas in the Nag Hammadi text, the Upper Egypt Gnostic text. So we have two apocalypses of James. And that's not James the son of John of Zebedee. The Gospels in the book of Acts know James the son of John, James the brother of John the son of Zebedee. But they don't want to, they know about James the brother of Jesus, but they don't want to tell us a lot about it. For instance, Acts can't avoid the fact of his existence after the other James evaporates or is beheaded in an odd manner by Herod the king around chapter 10, or 8 or 9 or 10, somewhere in there. Then the other James, the James brother of Jesus, suddenly materializes, but they don't tell us who he is. We've just gotten rid of one James, and then in the same chapter, Peter escapes from prison, goes to someone called Mary's house to leave a message for James and the brothers. That's the first introduction of James in the book of Acts. What? Who's James and the brothers? Acts doesn't tell us. Why doesn't Acts tell us? Because he doesn't want to tell us. Doesn't want to give him an introduction. I submit in my books that it had an introduction, but it was eradicated. And the introduction came with the election to replace Judas Iscariot. All the early church fathers tell us that after the ascension, or whatever you want to refer to Jesus' final days as, they got together and elected the successor, the person who would lead the early church. And Peter and John and the others demurred, and James was elected. Now that's in all the early church fathers, but it's not in the book of Acts. Instead, you have the election to succeed Judas. Why do you need an election to succeed Judas? Is the 12 apostle scheme fixed or something? Well, that's the impression that you're given. But the point of the matter is, far more important is it to elect the leader of the early church. That's ignored. So I think the fact that James appears later in Acts as if it had already been introduced, that had already been told you who he was, that in fact there was originally an introduction of James. And I tell you that Acts ends in 62 AD with Paul under loose house arrest in Rome, no information on how Paul ended, as if that was the most important event in 62 AD. Well, the execution of James, the leader of the early church, to my mind, is the most important event in 62 AD as far as the church is concerned, but that's missing. So you say, well, we know. How do we know about the execution of James? All the early church fathers and Josephus. That data, Josephus is probably accurate. Josephus knows about James. In fact, he likes James for some reason. And that doesn't look like tampered, interpolated material that you can think it is or not. It's in the Antiquities also, the execution of James in 62 AD and the reasons for it, and the fact that it was by the high priest Ben Annas, and it was objected to, Josephus says, by the people who cared most for righteousness and equity. Ananus ben Ananus, Ananus son of Ananus, is the son of the evil high priest in the Gospels. So I said, you should group people by their enemies. Ultimately, what happens to Ananus ben Ananus in Josephus? I told you, but I can repeat it. Do you remember? What happened?
They kill him and then throw him out.
That's why. Why are the zealots so upset about Ananus ben Ananus? Why do they probably urinate on him and cut off his sexual parts or something like that and throw him out without burial? Well, I would think they're upset about some of the things that he did, including the judicial murder of James. I would think that is really what's motivating them with this animus towards Ananus. Anyway, that's just a supposition. None of that is provable. That's the material in my James book, which is why I think it's different than most people have written before that time. So that's what makes it interesting, perhaps, or gets people's back up, perhaps. I don't know. It can go both ways, can't it? But anyway, let's go back here. So this Baptist person that he meets, to my mind, has a lot in common with James. He's a vegetarian like James, but he's beyond that. He's more than a vegetarian. He only eats food that grows of itself. Now we had in the Maccabee books, if you read them carefully, when Judas Maccabee is doing his uprising, it says that he went out in the wilderness with 9 other men and ate nothing but wild plants to avoid contracting pollution or defilement, because the temple sacrifice was no longer in existence. There was a statue of the Olympian Zeus in the temple, which had been desecrated by the Greco-Syrian Seleucids. So that also sounds like a sort of wild food episode. This time Judas Maccabee, the insurgent leader. And then, let me see if I can give you, okay, I suppose that'll be good enough for the moment on that particular subject. So, this Baptist then eats nothing but food that, oh, I know the punishment. If you look at the early church testimonies about James, there are 2 versions of it. One is found in Eusebius, 4th century, but he's quoting a writer by the name of early church father by the name of Hegesippus, whose works have not survived, what Eusebius has called them, and he's about 2nd century, 180, 160 to 180 or something. And Hegesippus speaks about when James is stoned, instead of Paul